Hello, my name is Kristen, and I'm a home baker and blogger from Chicago. And in addition to making video tutorials here on YouTube, I run the Instagram page at Foolproof Baking. I post all my recipes, methods, ruminations, and experiments over there in case you might be interested in having a look. I've spent some time recently testing out methods to make an open crumb 50% whole grain wheat sourdough bread that's both flavorful and nutritious. If you haven't ventured into sourdough before, I've got tutorials here on YouTube that cover the steps of how to make a sourdough starter from scratch, as well as tips on how to revive a refrigerated dormant starter, and I'll post these links below. To make our 50% whole grain wheat bread, we'll be following a rendition of this basic flow chart, which you might have seen me refer to in previous videos, specifically my tutorial on how to make a 20% whole wheat sourdough. While working with the higher whole grain, I made some adjustments that help make the dough easier to handle while still maintaining a nice, open, and light crumb structure in the final loaf. I'd like to take a moment to talk about a technique I've been working on, inspired by my favorite two-toned swirl breads. I'll be using a similar split dough technique for this whole wheat bread. The idea stems from the fact that different flours have different properties. They can differ in their protein or gluten composition, their extensibility or strength, the ability to absorb water, the response to an autolyse, as well as the level of coarse or fine grind, etc. This could be the difference between a high protein, strong bread flour and a 100% whole grain wheat flour, a low protein heritage grain such as einkorn, or maybe a rye flour, or even a gluten-free flour like buckwheat. In my experience, I found some benefits in keeping these grains separated early on in the process, only to layer and laminate them together once they've been ideally handled and developed. Overall, it makes for easier dough handling and gives a more light and open crumb in the end. With all that said, let's get started. For my whole grain wheat flour, I'll actually be using a mixture of half hard red and half hard white wheat. The red wheat is a spring wheat, and the white is a winter varietal. The difference has to do with when the wheat was grown and harvested. The white differs from the red in that it's lacking in a few genes that code for the color in the bran. The bran is the outer kernel of the wheat berry. Spring wheats have the highest protein content, while white wheats have maybe a sweeter, less bitter flavor than their red counterparts. You can mill your own grain, but for the purposes of this tutorial, I'll be using pre-milled whole grain flour from King Arthur and Bob's Red Mill. You can see that the flours differ slightly in color. The red wheat has tiny specks of red color, and the white is slightly more beige or pale. They are both milled very fine, which can help yield a more open and lacy crumb in the end. I'll go ahead and whisk together an equal weight of red and white wheat flours. This should be enough for the entire process ahead. I'd like to introduce you to my starter, Ozzy. I like to get my starter on a feed regimen of 2 to 3 feeds daily for a day or two before planning to use for a bake. This makes it healthy, strong, and really active. For more information, please check the tutorial linked to below. My starter is fed usually with a mix of bread flour and rye. And because of the high whole grain in this recipe, I'll transition my starter to a 50% whole wheat, 50% bread flour mix. It's now the evening before my big bake, and I'm going to feed at a high ratio of 1 to 10 to 10. This is the same as taking 3 grams of starter and adding 30 grams of flour and 30 grams of water. This way my starter does not run out of food source before I can feed again by morning. So let's combine our flours, and just remember the mix we are using is half wheat and half bread flour. In goes 15 grams of each to a fresh jar, along with 30 grams of water. To this mixture, we'll inoculate with 3 grams sourdough starter. That's what you see stuck to the spatula here. Mix this up well, Takes me about a minute of stirring to ensure everything is nicely mixed up. We'll let the starter rest with a loose fitted lid overnight. Okay guys, it's the next morning, a lovely day to make some bread. First, it's time to build our levain. Our overnight whole wheat starter is looking very active, at peak, and is ready for its next feed. It smells ripe, a bit of sweet and a bit of sour. Still has some nice strength to it as we've caught it at just the right time. You can hear the bubbles popping away as I stir the mixture. So I'm going to build my levain at a ratio of 1 to 1 to 1, meaning I'll mix a given amount of starter with the same amount of flour and water. We need 60 grams levain total, so let's measure out 25 grams starter to a new jar, like you see here. To this, add 25 grams of flour. Note this flour is composed of half bread flour and half whole wheat. And finally, add on top 25 grams water. This gives us a total of 75 grams. I like to make a little bit more than I need so I can feed again and keep it going for future bakes. After mixing thoroughly, cover and let rest someplace pretty warm. For a 50% whole wheat starter, it should take about 4 to 5 hours to fully activate and peak. I use a proofer box so I can keep the temperature at a pretty stable 78 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. However, a standard oven with a light on can be sufficient to create a similarly suitable environment for the levain to build. After getting the levain going, we can now prep our whole grain wheat autolyse. I like to do an extended autolyse when using whole grain wheat. Whole grain flour absorbs a lot of water, but it does require more time to fully hydrate. Additionally, it can take a while longer for the dough to become silky and soften up due to the presence of the bran. This autolyse will pre-soak for the same amount of time as the levain builds, about 4 to 5 hours. So we'll combine an equal weight of our flour mix with water, 150 grams each, and this actually puts us at 100% hydration for this dough. Go ahead and mix well. You really want to be sure that all the flour is in contact with water, no dry flour remaining. Then cover. I use a reusable shower cap, and rest on the counter until the levain is finished building. It's now mid-morning, about 2.5 hours before my levain will peak, and I'm going to prepare my bread flour autolyse. A quick note about this step. If you know that your bread flour is high protein and very strong, you can actually make things easier on yourself and prep this autolyse at the same time you prep your whole grain. If it works better for your schedule, then give it a try. Just note that the addition of water to flour activates proteolytic enzymes that function in the digestion of grain proteins, including gluten itself. And if you're working with a weaker flour, the dough can actually break down even before you begin your ferment, which is not ideal if you're shooting for a more open crumb. I've measured out 150 grams of bread flour, and I'll add water at a hydration of 86%. That would be 129 grams, and stir to mix. I use a fairly high protein bread flour, 12.7% protein, and it absorbs water very well. If you know that your given flour has a lower absorbency, it may be a good idea to hold back some of the water at this step. Once you're done mixing, cover and let this rest out on the counter until the levain is ready. Let's briefly touch on dough temperature, since I'll continue to refer to it throughout this tutorial. I like to try to maintain a cooler dough or ambient temperature in the low to mid 70s is great. This slows down the fermentation, giving more room for error and enough time to get in all the steps of this method. We're just coming off of summer now in Chicago, and I have kept my dough in the dining room where it tends to be a little cooler. But in the winter, I tend to keep my dough in the kitchen so it doesn't get overly cold. I've seen inventive bakers who live in very warm, humid climates create makeshift cooler boxes with the use of frozen water bottles in a cabinet or drawer. I do get a lot of questions about dough temperature and fermentation, and it's true that cooler dough temperatures will require a longer bulk ferment stage, while warmer temps will speed up the rate of fermentation. Additionally, higher whole grains, especially doughs made with fresh milled grain, will likely speed up your fermentation. You can play around with lower inoculation rates and lowering the hydration to help control the speed of your fermentation, but my best advice is to watch your dough and take lots of notes so that you can make changes with any follow-up bakes. It's now been about 5 hours since building the levain, and it's time to mix our dough. We've got some big bubbly action. Just a bit pre-peak is when I like to use mine. This ensures that the levain is full of strength and is not suffering from acid buildup. This here is just what I'm looking for, a nice and strong consistency, not watery at all. At this point, the autolyses are looking great. This is the bread flour dough, so beautifully silky and extensible. And likewise, the whole wheat is soft and pliable, able to also pull a window pane with no tearing. Go ahead and add your levain right on top of your bread flour dough. You can wet your hand and begin by spreading the levain across the top, dimpling the levain in with your fingertips. I like to use this method of hand mixing. First, pulling up the dough over onto itself, and then I'll use my fingers and thumb to massage the dough going around the bowl, pinching the dough together until you feel the dough takes on an even consistency. Use the high hydration of the dough to your advantage. This only takes about 2 to 3 minutes to fully incorporate the levain. I'll finish with rounding the dough off in the bowl to clean up. Cover and set aside. Repeat this same process with the wheat dough. You will note that this dough feels more stiff than the bread flour dough, despite the higher hydration and the longer autolyse. Whole wheat flour absorbs a lot more water than bread flour does. If you feel you need to add a pinch more water, now is the time to do it. 2 to 3 minutes is all it takes to finish mixing. We've now officially entered into the bulk ferment stage of our process. Note this time for your records. Cover the bowls and let rest about 30 minutes. Now that it's been 30 minutes since mixing in the levain, it's time to add the salt. I use a fine grained sea salt that incorporates very easily into the dough, and I like to use a little over 2% for both great flavor and to help strengthen the gluten strands in the dough. Addition of salt also helps slow down the fermentation and the enzymatic activity. Here's our 2 split doughs. You can see the doughs have relaxed out quite a bit, and here's the sea salt, which we can sprinkle right on top. With a wet hand, dimple the salt into the dough and begin massaging the dough again like with the levain earlier. Beautifully silky bread flour dough. It can resist you at first, but keep manipulating the dough, squeezing it and pinching it so that the salt works its way into the dough evenly. After 2 to 3 minutes, the dough will become very consistent all the way through, and that's when you know you're finished. We'll round off in the bowl, cover, and set aside. In contrast, the whole wheat dough is not quite as silky, though it has become nicely pliable and soft. The salt incorporates super easily since we're not struggling to compete with so much gluten. Just a brief 1 to 2 minute hand mix should do it. Easy enough. Cover and let rest 45 minutes. Next, we're going to layer the 2 doughs together. We'll take advantage of the lamination stage, which generally functions to introduce a lot of strength and structure into the dough at an early stage of the bulk. The vast majority of rise I get with my dough is in the last third of the bulk period. At this early stage, only an hour and a half or so after inoculation, the dough should not have any noticeable rise, so we don't need to concern ourselves too much with degassing. So here's how we'll do this. First, mist the counter with just a little bit of water, not too much. You want the dough to stick a bit and not just slide around. Take your bread flour dough and use a wet hand to scrape and release the dough from the bowl. Transfer to the countertop. You can use your bench knife to help lay out the dough more uniformly, but don't spread it out too much just yet. Right on top of the bread flour dough, add the whole wheat dough. Now, using wetted hands, lift and gently pull the dough outwards from the center. Work delicately and slowly so you don't tear the dough. Try not to pull from the edges, but pull instead from the center out. You'll end up forming a square or rectangular shape with the edges a little thicker than the center. Think like a pizza dough. Now the idea is to pick up one edge of the dough and fold into the center. Then fold the other side right on top of the first center fold. Finish by pulling the top down halfway and then the bottom up over the top. Move your dough to a fresh, bulking dish. I like to use this low-profile 8x8 Pyrex dish. Cover and let rest for about 45 minutes. The remainder of the bulk ferment stage is composed of a series of coil folds. These folds will help strengthen and structure your dough as it increases in volume. I get a lot of questions about the number and frequency of these folds, and honestly, this is going to be dependent on several variables. Primarily, your dough temperature, which is going to have a direct effect on your speed of fermentation, your dough extensibility, which is how pliable and loose the dough feels, and likewise, your dough strength, or how much your dough resists your manipulations. You are looking for a dough rise of approximately 50%, and again note that most of this rise happens in that last third of the bulk period. For this particular dough, at my stable dough temperature of 74 degrees Fahrenheit, I'll end up doing a full 6-hour bulk. After the lamination step, I'll manage to get in 3 coil folds at 45 to 60 minute intervals. Your dough may require more or less folds, depending on how it develops through this stage. This is how the dough looks now 45 minutes since lamination. Notice how the dough has relaxed and flattened out to cover the bottom of the dish. It's quite silky and extensible, but we must build up some strength. With wet hands, reach with your fingers under the dough. Connect your middle fingertips and pull the dough up slowly and evenly, detaching the dough on the side farther away from you. The dough will naturally wrap under itself. You may need to pull the dough again to get a nice taut wrap. That's fine. Once finished, perform the same coil fold again on the other side. I generally pick up the entire center mass and pull back to let the dough detach, then lay the center mass right back on top. Continue the coil folds on the sides of the dough as well, and be sure as you go, pop any large air pockets you might encounter. These aren't generally signs of fermentation, they're pockets introduced during the earlier steps. This single coil fold introduces such incredible strength and shape into the dough. Now is a great time to get a temperature reading. Take note of how the dough looks now, and we'll see how much it relaxes and flattens out over the next 45 minutes. It's been 45 minutes, and we're going to check on the dough to see if it's ready for a second coil fold. We've got some spreading out and relaxing since the last fold. However, you might notice that it has more curvature at the edges and hasn't completely filled out the bottom. It also has a little more volume to it. We can go ahead and do the second coil fold now. Just a note that we're still at right around 74 degrees Fahrenheit. We'll check on the dough in an hour. 60 minutes later, and onto the third coil fold. You may begin to see a more substantial rise by now. I'm making a mental note that shaping is going to be in about 1.5 to 2 hours. If you're having problems with strength, there's definitely time to get in another fold if you feel it's necessary. Pay attention to how extensible the dough is at this stage, or how much it's flattening out during the rest periods. This particular dough is looking plump and strong, and so no additional folds will be necessary. We've now reached the end of the bulk ferment stage. It's been a little under 2 hours since the last coil fold, about 6 hours since adding the levain. The dough should appear puffy and somewhat lighter in color, having grown approximately 50% in volume. There should be a roundness at the edges, overall looking plump and full of life. We will skip the pre-shape as our coil folds function themselves to organize the dough, so we'll just go straight to the final shaping. You'll want to liberally flour your dough along the bottom part of the dish as well as the counter. Use your floured fingers to help release the dough from the top of the dish and flip over onto the counter. Use a bench knife to tuck flour under the edges of the dough and then remove the excess flour from the workspace. Your shape should be mostly square or rectangular already, but you can use your bench knife to arrange the dough in the proper shape. Pick up a side flap and gently pull out and up and over, resting the flap into the center third of the dough mound, and do the same with the other side flap. Next, you'll lift the top of the dough up and over, then begin to roll down onto itself. I like to use my thumbs to gently but firmly tuck the dough in, creating a more taut surface on the top of the dough. At the end of the roll, tuck the seam to seal the bottom edge, then use your fingers to pinch the edges to seal. Dust with brown rice flour and get your banneton ready. My favorite banneton is this one, an oval batard shape. Flip over your dough so that the seam is facing up, top of the dough facing down. Gently lift and transfer the dough into the banneton. Cover and we'll move on to the proofing stage. Whenever I'm able, I prefer to add in an overnight refrigerated retard. Very cold temperatures prevent additional dough rise. I use it more as a rest period to let the gluten relax. If you are getting a lot of rise in the fridge, double check your actual temperature and note that if you prefer to let your dough rise overnight, just cut back on your bulk a bit so you won't have issues with over-fermentation. Another benefit for keeping your fridge temp very cold, I've had no issues letting my dough rest for up to a full day, though on average I run the final proof for about 12 to 16 hours, mostly to fit with my schedule. The next morning, and it's now time to slash and bake. While the dough rests in the refrigerator, I will get my cast iron Challenger bread pan in the oven to preheat. I began using this pan a few months back and prefer it to other methods of baking I've tried. The handles are placed intuitively and make for very easy handling of the pan in and out of the oven. I like how the shape conforms to my dough, no wasted space, and the pan has a tight seal on the edges to trap steam. Importantly, the pan also has a low profile, so you can easily get your dough in the pan with minimal risk of injury. And though cast iron is a preferred method for bread baking, many bakers struggle with burning on the bottom crust. To eliminate this issue, I place the pan on a broil tray with an air gap during baking, or you can use 2 inverted sheet pans as Trevor Wilson uses. I've provided an affiliate link below in the description if you're interested in maybe purchasing one for your own home oven. So now the pan has been preheating for an hour, and the dough has been resting in the fridge for 14 hours. Straight from the fridge, and while still cold, we'll get some semolina flour on there to prevent sticking issues. Cover the dough with a sheet of parchment, and carefully flip over so now the dough is oriented properly. Peel away the banneton and place somewhere warm to dry. We're now going to create a slice or score in the dough for steam release. I use a curved blade attached to a lame, but you can use a straight edge, just holding the blade in your hand, or even just a serrated knife. Give the dough a slash, approximately a ½ inch deep and at a shallow angle. This will help encourage an ear to form as the dough rises in the oven. The flap will actually peel back while the dough puffs up like a balloon, like you see here. This also allows for maximal oven spring and can help prevent the dough from bursting out in places you don't want it to, like the bottom or the sides, while it rises in the oven. So after the hour preheat at 485, my pan is nice and hot. Carefully, while wearing heat safety gloves, lift the lid off and set aside. Slide in your slashed dough with the parchment paper. Replace the lid, and we'll place the pan back in the oven directly on top of the broil tray. We'll let this bake in the oven, covered, for 20 minutes. After that time, open the oven door and remove the lid. Looks like we got a beautiful oven spring. Close the door and lower the temperature to 450 degrees Fahrenheit. Continue baking about 18 to 22 more minutes uncovered until the loaf looks browned to your liking. I like a more bold bake, so I'll go the full 22 minutes. Here we have it. This opened up quite beautifully in the oven. Got a nice striking ear and a crackly crust. You can see the broil tray helped prevent any burning, and by knocking on the bottom of the loaf, you can tell if your loaf is baked properly. If it sounds hollow, you're golden. I'll let this cool a couple hours and then we'll slice it up. I'm super happy with the results here. On top of the overall shape and thin, crackly, crisp crust, I really appreciate the lightness of the crumb. Despite this being 50% whole wheat, I've got a nice even distribution of open alveoli throughout, just what I was looking for. This really smells heavenly. I can't wait to share this one with family and friends. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope you found this video helpful. Just a note that I do have for sale a PDF that you can download from the site Gumroad. I'll post the link below. This is a fully supplemental form that goes along with the tutorial here. Everything in the video is written out, but if you'd like to help support my channel and get something out of it at the same time, please check it out. For questions, I respond best through direct message on my Instagram page, Foolproof Baking, though I'll try my best to answer questions in the comments section below as they pop up. Thanks again.